Hi there. This is Phil St. Romain from the team of Heartland Center for Spirituality in Great Bend, Kansas. In this teaching, we will be discussing the meaning of meditation and contemplative prayer as understood in the Christian mystical tradition. It often happens that when meeting with someone for the first time in spiritual direction, they tell me that they meditate regularly. I then ask what they mean by meditation, and there are numerous methods described. In this presentation, I will present a perspective on these different approaches. First, let's state what we mean by prayer, using a definition from St. John Damascene in the 8th century. He states that prayer is raising the mind and heart to God. It has something then to do with relationship with God. Prayer can be verbal, nonverbal, and there are many forms of both. So let's put that in perspective. One type of prayer we call kataphatic. Kataphatic is a Greek word. It means affirmative or positive. In kataphatic prayer, we make use of words, concepts, symbols, music, art, like a human relationship where we speak and act to communicate. So we do in kataphatic prayer. The content helps to direct our attention to God and to receive a response from God, who speaks to us kataphatically as well. Broadly, this type of prayer is conversational and dialogical, and there are many forms, as we shall see. A second large grouping or way of looking at prayer is that it can be apophatic. This is sometimes called the negative way. It emphasizes silence, mystery, intuitive knowing. More right brain, I guess we could say. Apophatic prayer recognizes that God is beyond all concepts, and some methods of prayer emphasize this approach. Kataphatic and apophatic are on a continuum. For example, there are some simplified kataphatic forms that give way to apophatic. It can be something of a dance where one prays kataphatically for a while using content, words, singing, and then moves into silence for a while. Okay, a couple of other ways of looking at prayer. It can be concentrative, and this has to do with our attention. Concentrative prayer implies a sustained focus on an object, word, or phrase. It's a kind of one-pointed concentration to tune out what is outside. An example of this would be mantra prayer, or gazing at a candle, or icon gazing. And finally, receptive prayer, where the attention is not so sustained and focused, but open and receptive and relaxed. There is, here too, non-attachment to mental activity that isn't about God. One good example of this would be centering prayer, and we'll say a little bit more about that later. Okay, let's put it all together now, and we'll note 4 different quadrants with different examples of prayer in each one. First, there's the continuum we mentioned before between apophatic and kataphatic. We note that on a line here, and so lots of different kinds of prayer along that continuum. There's another continuum, however, between the active or concentrative forms of prayer and the passive or receptive forms of prayer. So there we have our 4 quadrants. We might call them concentrative kataphatic, concentrative apophatic, kataphatic receptive, apophatic receptive. Okay, here's some examples then. For the first quadrant, which is more active, we're using content to relate to God and to receive a response from God. Liturgical prayer fits in there. Intercessory prayer when we're praying for others or other intentions. Mental prayer, reading and reflecting on Scripture, for example, part of the Lectio Divina process. It's kataphatic and active as well. Chanting, another example that goes here. The rosary also. Lots of content there, although we're becoming a little more receptive, moving toward the receptive line. Affective prayer also moving toward the receptive line. And then in the active forms of concentrative prayer, that is apophatic, there's the mantra, repeating a word or phrase, breath prayer, mindfulness, just noticing what our attention is on and keeping our attention in the present moment. Icon gazing kind of spans those two. It's got a kataphatic and an apophatic dimension to it. The Jesus prayer does as well. Centering prayer, where we're using a word or phrase to hold our attention before God, but in a kind of a relational way. Now, that line that separates concentrative and receptive might be defined as recollection, where the mind and will are focused toward God. Okay, we'll keep that in mind. It's still on the active side of things. When we get onto the passive or receptive side of things, we're beginning to speak of mystical experience proper. And here it's important to introduce a word, agency. In active forms of prayer, the human is initiating the content, the activity. It begins with the human, and God can meet us there, certainly. It's not second-rate prayer, as sometimes we get the impression from certain writers. With mystical prayer, this passive receptive form, the agency is with God. God is the one who initiates, and we consent to it, and we participate in the experience. But we don't cause it. We can't cause it. Okay, so there are kataphatic mystical experiences. We don't speak of that very often. The literature these days seems to emphasize apophatic. But for example, prophecies, where the Spirit speaks to us about a certain situation or even the future, agency lies with the divine on that. It's a mystical experience. Locutions, hearing God speak to us. Visions, inspirational messages, and we could go on. And so these all need to be discerned. Sometimes it might seem like it comes from the person, or does it come from God? But they certainly can and do come from God, and there are many examples among mystics in the history of our religion. Mystical experiences that are more apophatic, prayer of quiet, beginning to rest in God in infused contemplation. Prayer of union, a deeper development of the prayer of quiet, where even our intellectual awareness seems to be silenced, and we're just silently absorbed in divine presence. Then there are these non-dual experiences that so many write about these days, leaving us with a sense of connectedness with everything, including the source of being, different in some ways from the prayer of quiet and the prayer of union and other forms of receptive apophatic experience. Keeping in mind the distinctions we made in our previous slide, we can begin to speak now more clearly about our topic, meditation and contemplation. Meditation in Christianity and throughout the West is usually kataphatic and active. And when I use those terms West and Christianity, it's very general. It would be far better if we would say that meditation is kataphatic and active, or we're referring to kataphatic active prayer. Examples would be mental prayer, such as we do in Lectio Divina, where we read Scripture, reflect on it, make some sort of act of resolution, pray for others perhaps. The Rosary is a form of meditation, also the Jesus prayer, and even centering prayer, although it's a radically simplified form of meditation. Meditation in a more Eastern religious perspective is usually apophatic and active. There are many exceptions to this. There are many devotional practices in Hinduism, for example, that are highly kataphatic. But usually when people are referring to meditation in an Eastern sense, they're referring to an apophatic active practice like a mantra or breath prayer or mindfulness. And that's usually what my spiritual directees mean when they tell me that they learn to meditate on a retreat. Contemplation in a Christian sense usually means deepening meditation to recollectedness, where the will and the mind are focused toward God, and then a more passive experience of prayer or infused contemplation where the agency is with God, an apophatic passive form of prayer. Then there's contemplation in an Eastern perspective, and they sometimes use different terms, like samadhi, for example. It's apophatic and passive also, non-dual, enlightenment-type experiences characterized by a sense of oneness or connectedness with everything. It's usually missing a relational, interpersonal context with the divine, although even that can be present in some cases. Let's talk about the journey from Christian meditation to contemplation, in a very general sense, how it usually goes, but there are many, many exceptions. First, what is needed is a practice of personal prayer. This journey doesn't usually happen in people who just pray sporadically, on the go, maybe go to Mass once a week or some other kind of church service. So you have to have time set aside to be with God regularly. Personal prayer. Go to your private room, close the door, be with your God in secret. Then there's some sort of active practice, which we call meditation, and we've said that that's kataphatic and active. Reading Scripture, reflecting on Scripture, perhaps singing can be part of it. Maybe icon gazing or something like that can be part of it as well. Lectio Divina, the practice of reading and meditating on Scripture, seems to be the most usual form that we find. Then there's recollectedness, where the mind and will become focused toward God with few distractions. And that can be the outcome of a prayer session, which we would call then acquired recollection. Or it can become more habitual. As the spiritual life is lived more consistently and deeply, a person lives in a state of recollectedness. So everybody can do at least these active practices. Everybody can pray, everybody can meditate, everybody can come to experience recollection more consistently. And if we do so, and we remain quietly present to God, using some simple kataphatic method at times to sustain recollectedness, then we may find ourselves at times drawn into the prayer of quiet, which is really infused contemplation, a form of mystical prayer. The agency, as we said in a previous slide, is with God in infused contemplation. God is the one who takes us there, who helps us to rest. We know we're in a different state. We just want to be there, this obscure, loving silence that St. John of the Cross talked about. Our intellectual awareness is awake. We might be kind of curious about what's going on, but we're more content just to rest and to be with God. How long it lasts? It's up to God. We can at any time stand up and excuse ourselves. If someone comes to the door and knocks, well, we can go and answer the door if we want to. But that's the prayer of quiet. And by the way, the prayer of quiet can come even to a beginner very early on, where they're in some active practice and they just feel drawn to rest and be with God in loving silence. So there's this notion that infused contemplation doesn't happen except to people who've been living the life of prayer for a very long time and live in a state of recollectedness for long periods of time, and then finally God pulls them there. No, this is a grace from God that God can give whenever God wishes. St. Teresa of Avila describes a prayer of union, which can be a further development of the prayer of quiet, a deeper mystical silence, where the intellect, memory, and imagination become silent. We become absorbed in God beyond all thoughts, just content to be with God. How long does that last? Well, it endures even beyond the time of prayer. We are in that kind of silence. And St. Teresa goes on to speak of other stages, one she calls ecstatic union, which happens to some people, where the contemplative grace seems to overflow even into the senses, where one is not even aware of one's bodily senses functioning. So it's a deeper absorption. It's usually not for a prolonged period. It's just temporary, perhaps, as the body becomes acclimated to contemplative grace. Then there's transforming union, which is a permanent union between the human will and God, so that even when one is living the active life, one is united with God. Sometimes call that the unitive stage. So we see the journey of prayer as a beautiful journey to deeper and deeper belonging and loving connectedness with God.